The dust had settled on Jacob McKenna's boots for the 1,000th time that summer, but today felt different. As he stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, watching the sun paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson, something stirred in the evening air that hadn't been there in 7 long years. 7 years since he'd lost everything that mattered. Jacob pulled his worn hat lower over his eyes, the brim casting shadows across a face that had grown harder with each passing season. The Triple Crown Ranch stretched out before him, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land that should have been filled with cattle and the laughter of children. Instead, it held only memories and the echo of a man's footsteps walking alone. The sound of approaching horses made him straighten. Visitors were rare out here, 20 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Ridge. Jacob's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip, a habit born from years of living on the edge of civilization where trust was earned with sweat and blood. But as the riders crested the hill, his breath caught in his throat like a man seeing a ghost. 6 women rode toward his ranch, their silhouettes graceful against the dying light. Even from a distance, Jacob could see they weren't ordinary travelers. They rode with purpose there. Posture, speaking of determination, despite the obvious exhaustion in their movements. As they drew closer, Jacob's weathered heart began to hammer against his ribs. The lead rider, a woman with auburn hair, catching the last rays of sunlight, sat tall in her saddle, despite the dust and fatigue that marked a long journey. Something about the way she held herself, the tilt of her chin, the gentle curve of her shoulders. "Dear God," Jacob whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper. The woman's eyes met his across the distance, and 7 years elapsed into nothing. Those eyes green as spring grass after a mountain rain had haunted his dreams every night since. She'd disappeared from his life. Eyes that had once looked at him with such love that he'd believed he could move mountains for her. Margaret Rose Whitmore, the woman who was supposed to be his wife. The riders approached slowly, and Jacob could see now that all 6 women were young, beautiful, and clearly from refined backgrounds, despite their travel-worn appearances. Their clothes, though dusty from the trail, were of fine quality. These weren't frontier women, they were Eastern ladies. As out of place on his rough ranch as pearls in a pig pen, but it was Margaret who held his attention. Margaret who made his world tilt on its axis. She was more beautiful than his memories had allowed, her face touched with a maturity that only deepened her grace. The girl he'd known had become a woman of striking elegance. Even exhausted and dusty from hard travel, the group stopped 30 feet from his porch. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the prairie grass and the soft snorting of the horses. Then Margaret rose, dismounted with fluid grace, her boots hitting the packed earth with barely a sound. The other 5 women followed her lead, and Jacob watched in stunned silence as all 6 of them walked toward his porch. What happened next would be burned into Jacob's memory forever as one. All 6 women dropped to their knees in the dust before his porch. Margaret Rose looked up at him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears, her voice carrying across the evening air like a prayer. "Jacob McKenna," she said, her voice the same gentle melody that had sung him to sleep in his dreams for 7 years. "We've come to beg your forgiveness and to ask for your help." Jacob's legs nearly buckled. He gripped the porch railing with white knuckles, his mind reeling. The sight of Margaret Rose on her knees before him was like a knife twisting in his chest. This proud, beautiful woman who had once been the light of his world, what could have brought her to this? "Get up," he said hoarsely. "All of you, get up, don't kneel to me." But Margaret Rose shook her head, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the dust. "Please, Jacob, let me speak. Let me explain why we had to come to you." The other women remained silent, their heads bowed respectfully, but Jacob barely noticed them. His entire world had narrowed to the woman kneeling in his yard. The woman who had shattered his heart so completely that he'd fled civilization itself to escape the pain. "You left," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of 7 years of anguish. "You left without a word, Margaret Rose. Left me standing at the altar like a fool while the whole town watched. Margaret Rose's shoulders shook with silent sobs. I know. I know what I did to you, and I've lived with the shame of it every day since. But Jacob, if you'll let me tell you why. Why? The word exploded from Jacob like a gunshot, and the horses shied nervously. 7 years of buried pain erupted in that single syllable. You want to tell me why you humiliated me in front of everyone I knew? Why you broke every promise we ever made? Why you took my heart and crushed it under your pretty little boots? Margaret Rose flinched as if he'd struck her, but she didn't rise from her knees. Because I was protecting you, she whispered. Because I loved you too much to let them destroy you. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. What are you talking about? My father, Margaret Rose said, her voice growing stronger even as the tears continued to fall. He threatened to ruin you, Jacob, to take everything you owned, to make sure you never worked again. He had the power to do it, the connections, the money, the influence. When I told him I was going to marry you, he gave me a choice. World tilted again. What choice? Leave you and marry the man he'd chosen for me, or watch him destroy everything you'd worked for? Your ranch, your reputation, your future, all of it gone. Margaret Rose's voice broke completely. I couldn't let him do that to you, Jacob. I loved you too much. The silence that followed was deafening. Jacob stared down at the woman who had been his everything, his mind struggling to process what she'd just told him. Believed she'd abandoned him for someone richer, more refined, more worthy of her Eastern breeding. All these years he'd carried the poison of believing he hadn't been enough for her. So you married him, Jacob said finally, his voice hollow. You married the man your father chose. Margaret Rose nodded miserably. Lord Edmund Ashworth. A British nobleman with business interests in America? Father thought it would elevate our family status. She laughed bitterly. It was the biggest mistake of my life. One of the other women, a blonde with kind eyes, placed a gentle hand on Margaret Rose's shoulder. Tell him the rest, Maggie. Tell him why we're here. Margaret Rose looked up at Jacob, and he saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. Fear, deep, bone-deep terror that had nothing to do with his anger and everything to do with whatever had driven her to travel hundreds of miles to kneel in the dust of his ranch. Edmund is dead, she said quietly. He died 3 months ago. And his brother, Lord William Ashworth, has made it clear that he intends to collect on what he considers his inheritance. Jacob didn't understand at first, but the blonde woman's next words made everything crystal clear. He wants Margaret Rose and all of us, she said, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. We were Edmund's collection. His brother believes we now belong to him. The rage that swept through Jacob was like wildfire. His hands clenched into fists, and he had to fight the urge to put them through the nearest wall. Collection? Repeated, his voice deadly quiet. Margaret Rose's voice was barely a whisper. Edmund wasn't the gentleman my father believed him to be. He had particular tastes. He collected beautiful women like other men collect horses or art. I was his wife. But these 5, she gestured to the women kneeling beside her. They were his ... companions. Women he bought or coerced or threatened into his service. Jacob's vision went red around the edges. The thought of Margaret Rose trapped in such a situation made him want to ride to England and dig up the bastard just so he could kill him again. His brother William is worse, continued the blonde woman. When Edmund died, he made it clear that he expected us to transfer our loyalty to him. When we refused, he became violent. We barely escaped with our lives. We've been running for 3 months, added another woman, this one a brunette with haunted eyes, his men looking for us everywhere. But Margaret Rose remembered you, remembered stories of the American frontier where a man's word means something. She said if anyone could protect us, it would be you. Jacob looked down at Margaret Rose, still kneeling in the dust, and felt something crack open in his chest. All these years, he'd hated her for leaving him. She'd been trapped, forced, into a nightmare that no woman should endure. And now, she'd come back to him, not for love, but for protection. Get up, he said again, his voice gentler this time. All of you, please get up. This time, Margaret Rose obeyed. She rose gracefully to her feet, brushing the dust from her skirts. With trembling hands, the other women followed suit, and Jacob found himself facing 6 pairs of hopeful, frightened eyes. "You want me to protect you from this, Lord William?" Jacob said. It wasn't a question. Margaret Rose nodded. "I know I have. No right to ask anything of you after what I did.
Ow.
I know you must hate me." "I don't hate you," Jacob interrupted, surprised to find it was true. The rage he'd carried for 7 years was still there, but it was transforming into something else. A fierce protectiveness that burned in his chest like a forge fire. "I never hated you, Margaret Rose. I just didn't understand." Hope flickered in her green eyes. "Then you'll help us." Jacob looked at the 6 women standing in his yard, refugees from a world of privilege that had turned into a nightmare. They had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to, and despite everything that had happened between them, Margaret Rose had known she could come to him. That realization hit him harder than any physical blow could have. "This isn't charity I'm offering," he said finally. "This ranch is isolated, but it's not a fortress. If this Lord William is as determined as you say, he'll find you eventually. When he does, there's going to be trouble." "We understand," Margaret Rose said. "We'll work for our keep. We're not helpless, Jacob. We can cook, clean, tend animals, whatever you need." Jacob almost smiled at that. The idea of these refined Eastern ladies mucking out stalls and branding cattle was almost comical. But there was determination in their eyes, a strength born of desperation and the will to survive. "All right," he said finally. "You can stay. But there are conditions." Margaret Rose nodded eagerly. "Anything. First, you do exactly what I say. When I say it, no questions asked. If I tell you to hide, you hide. If I tell you to run, you run. Out here, hesitation can get you killed." "Agreed." "Second, you earn. Your keep. This isn't a boarding house. Everyone works. Everyone contributes. The frontier doesn't care about your breeding or your delicate sensibilities. We understand." Jacob paused, looking directly into Margaret Rose's eyes. "Third, we settle. Things between us. All the things that were left unsaid 7 years ago. I won't have that hanging over us while we're fighting for our lives." Margaret Rose's breath caught, but she nodded. "Yes. We need to talk." "Good." Jacob stepped back, suddenly aware that the sun had set while they'd been talking. The prairie had taken on the deep purple hues of twilight, and the first stars were beginning to appear. "Right now, though, you all need food and rest. We'll deal with everything else tomorrow." As if summoned by his words, the blonde woman stepped forward. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said with a slight curtsy that seemed automatic despite their circumstances. "And I must say, Mr. McKenna, we're all grateful for your kindness." The other women introduced themselves in turn. Rebecca Chen, a stunning woman of mixed Chinese and European heritage. Isabella Santos, whose dark beauty spoke of Spanish ancestry. Marie Dubois, whose French accent was barely detectable. And Catherine O'Brien, whose Irish heritage was written in her fiery red hair and green eyes. Each woman had her own story, Jacob realized. Each had been caught in Edmund Ashworth's web in her own way. But those stories would come later. Right now they needed the basics of survival. "There's a bunkhouse behind the main house," Jacob said, leading them across the yard. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and warm. We'll figure out better arrangements tomorrow." Yes. As they walked, Margaret Rose fell into step beside him, close enough that he could smell the scent of her hair, despite the dust and exhaustion. It was the same lavender scent he remembered, the one that used to fill his senses when he held her close. "Jacob," she said quietly, her voice meant for his ears alone. "Thank you. I know this can't be easy for you." He glanced at her, noting the way the starlight caught in her hair, the familiar curve of her profile. "Nothing about this is easy, Margaret Rose. But that doesn't mean it's wrong." She was quiet for a moment. "I never stopped thinking about you," she whispered finally. "In all those years, in all that darkness, thinking about you was what kept me sane." Jacob's step faltered slightly, but he didn't respond. He couldn't, not yet. The wound she'd left in his heart was too fresh, despite the years. Learning the truth about why she'd left helped, but it didn't erase the pain. That would take time if it could be erased at all. The bunkhouse was spartanly furnished, but clean, with 6 narrow beds and basic amenities. Jacob lit the oil lamps, while the women looked around their new quarters with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I'll bring food from the main house," Jacob said. "Tomorrow we'll work out a routine, but tonight you need rest." As he turned to leave, Margaret Rose caught his arm. Her touch sent electricity through his entire body, just as it had 7 years ago. "Jacob, wait. There's something else you need to know about Lord William. He's not coming alone." Jacob turned back, his expression grim. "How many men?" "At least a dozen. Professional killers, Jacob. Men who've done this kind of work before. He has the money to hire the best." "When do you think they'll find us?" Margaret Rose exchanged glances with the other women. It was Sarah who answered. "We've been very careful, covering our tracks, but William has resources we can barely imagine. I'd say we have maybe 2 weeks, possibly 3 if we're lucky." Jacob nodded slowly. 3 weeks to prepare for a war. 3 weeks to turn his peaceful ranch into a fortress. 3 weeks to figure out how to protect 6 women against a dozen professional killers. 3 weeks to decide what Margaret Rose's return to his life really meant. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow we start preparing." As Jacob walked back to the main house, his mind was already working through strategies and preparations. He'd need to send word to town, maybe hire some help, check his ammunition, supplies, plan defensive positions, think about escape routes if things went badly. But underneath all the tactical planning, his heart was struggling with a completely different kind of preparation. Margaret Rose was back in his life, more beautiful than ever, vulnerable and grateful, and looking at him with those green eyes that had always been his weakness. 7 years ago, she'd broken his heart to save his life. Now she'd come back to him for protection, trusting him with not just her life, but the lives of 5 other women. The irony wasn't lost on him. She'd sacrificed their love to protect him. Now she needed him to risk everything to protect her. As he reached his porch, Jacob paused to look back at the bunkhouse, where warm light spilled from the windows and the silhouettes of the women moved about, settling in for the night. For the first time in 7 years, his ranch didn't feel empty. It felt like the calm before a storm. The next morning dawned clear and cold. With frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds, Jacob was up before sunrise, as was his habit. But today he wasn't alone. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted from the main house, and when he stepped inside, he found Sarah Mitchell working at his stove with the competence of someone who knew her way around a kitchen. "Good morning, Mr. McKenna," she said with a smile. "I hope you don't mind I took the liberty of starting breakfast. The others will be along shortly." Jacob poured himself coffee from the pot she'd prepared, noting that it was stronger and better than anything he'd managed to make for himself in years. "Thank you, and call me Jacob. Mr. McKenna was my father." Sarah nodded, flipping bacon with practiced ease. "I should tell you, we're not completely helpless city girls." Margaret Rose made sure we all learned practical skills during our time with Edmund. She said a woman needed to be able to take care of herself, no matter what circumstances she found herself in. Before Jacob could respond, the door opened, and the other women filed in, Margaret Rose among them. She'd changed from her traveling clothes into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she looked more like the frontier woman she was trying to become than the Eastern lady she'd been raised to be. "Good morning, Jacob," she said, and he heard something different in her voice, a determination that hadn't been there the night before. "We're ready to work." Over breakfast, they discussed the practical arrangements. The women would take turns with cooking and household duties, while also learning the basics of ranch work. Jacob would start teaching them to shoot, both for protection and because extra hands were always useful during hunting season. "Oh, what about the town?" Rebecca asked. "Should we stay away from Cedar Ridge?" Jacob considered this. "For now, yes. The fewer people who know you're here, the better. But I'll need to go in for supplies, and I want to talk to Sheriff Morrison about the situation. Can he be trusted?" Marie asked, her French accent more pronounced when she was worried. "Mostem Morrison's a good man," Jacob replied. "Fought in the war, knows how to handle trouble. If Lord William's men show up asking questions, Tom will know how to handle them. After breakfast, Jacob began the process of turning his peaceful ranch into a defensive position. He showed the women the layout of the property, pointing out potential hiding spots and escape routes. The ranch house sat on a slight rise, giving a good view of the surrounding terrain, but it also made them visible to anyone approaching. The advantage we have, Jacob explained as they walked the perimeter, is that we know this land. Every rock, every gully, every tree. Anyone coming? After us, we'll be operating blind. Margaret Rose walked beside him, asking practical questions about fields of fire and defensive positions. The other women followed, their faces serious as they absorbed lessons that might mean the difference between life and death. "You're thinking like a soldier," Margaret Rose observed as they paused near the barn. "I was a soldier," Jacob replied. "Served under General Grant during the war. Learned a few things about tactics and survival." She studied his face, noting the scars she'd never seen before, thin line along his jaw, another that disappeared into his hairline. "I never knew." "You never mentioned the war in your letters? Not much point dwelling on it. That was another life." Jacob's voice was matter-of-fact. But Margaret Rose heard the weight of memory beneath his words. As the days passed, the women proved themselves more capable than Jacob had expected. Sarah turned out to be an excellent cook and organizer, turning his bachelor household into a efficiently run operation. Rebecca had a gift with animals. And the horses responded to her gentle touch better than they ever had. To Jacob's, sometimes impatient handling Isabella, possessed surprising knowledge of herbal medicine. The result of time spent with her grandmother before her family's fortune brought her to Edmund's attention. Marie was quick with languages and had a sharp mind for strategy, often asking perceptive questions about their defensive preparations. Catherine, despite her delicate appearance, proved herself fearless when it came to learning to handle weapons. She absorbed Jacob's shooting lessons with fierce concentration, as if each bullet she learned to place accurately was a step toward freedom. But it was Margaret Rose who surprised him most. The sheltered Eastern belle he'd known had been replaced by a woman of quiet strength and practical intelligence. She worked alongside him repairing fences, helped him move cattle to more defensible pastures, and listened carefully to his explanations of ranch operations with the attention of someone who genuinely wanted to learn. On the fourth evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Margaret Rose finally broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "You said we needed to settle things between us," she said quietly, "that were left unsaid." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. 7 years is a long time, Margaret Rose. I'm not the same man I was then. Neither am I the same woman. She turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the first. "Stars, I need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did. Harder than anything Edmund put me through afterward." "Tell me about it," Jacob said. "About your marriage, about what he did to you." Margaret Rose was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if she were recounting someone else's story. "He was charming at first, sophisticated, worldly. Everything my father thought I needed in a husband. But once we were married and on his estate in England, the mask came off." She wrapped her arms around herself, despite the evening's warmth. "He collected beautiful things, Jacob. Art, jewelry, horses, and women. He liked to own things that others couldn't have." Jacob's hands clenched into fists, but he remained silent. "I was his prize, his legitimate wife, but I wasn't enough for him. He brought other women to the estate, Sarah, Rebecca. The others. Some came willingly, drawn by his wealth and promises. Others he acquired through debts their families owed, or threats, or simply by buying them from men who saw them as commodities." "And you couldn't leave?" Margaret Rose laughed bitterly. "Where would I go? Back to America in disgrace, to face the father who'd sold me into that marriage? Edmund made it clear that if I ever tried to leave, he'd destroy anyone who helped me. He had the connections to do it, Jacob. Influence that reached across oceans. So you endured it. I survived it. And I tried to help the others survive it too. became their protector, their advocate when Edmund's tastes turned violent. I learned to manage his moods, to redirect his attention when he focused too intently. On one of the girls, I became someone I never thought I could be. Jacob turned to look at her, seeing her clearly for the first time since her return. This wasn't the sheltered girl he'd known 7 years ago. This was a woman forged in fire, shaped by circumstances that would have broken someone weaker. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Sorry you had to endure that. Sorry I wasn't there to protect." You couldn't have protected me from my father's choices," Margaret Rose replied. "And if I'd stayed and married you, Edmund would have found another wife to torment. And those 5 women would still be trapped in that hell with no one to speak for them." Jacob was quiet, processing her words. There was wisdom in them, a perspective, born of suffering that he was only beginning to understand. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally. "The choice you made?" Margaret Rose considered the question carefully. "Regret the pain I caused you, or regret the years we lost?" "But I can't regret saving those women, Jacob. They're like sisters to me now. We've been through something together that created bonds stronger than blood." As if summoned by her words, the other women began appearing on the porch, drawn by the cooling evening air and the prospect of a few peaceful moments before bed. Sarah brought tea. Rebecca carried a guitar she'd found in the bunkhouse. And soon they were all gathered in a loose circle. Sharing stories and gentle laughter, Jacob watched Margaret Rose with the other women, seeing how naturally she took on the role of protector and leader. When Catherine shivered in the cooling air, Margaret Rose draped her own shawl around the younger woman's shoulders. When Isabella looked sad, thinking perhaps of the family she'd left behind, Margaret Rose took her hand and squeezed it reassuringly. These women had been through hell together, and they'd emerged not broken but bonded. They were family now in every way that mattered. "Jacob," Sarah said, pulling him from his thoughts. "Margaret Rose tells us, you used to play the harmonica. Would you play something for us?" Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Haven't played." "In years, please," Catherine added her voice to the request. "It's been so long since we've had music that wasn't tainted by bad memories." Jacob looked at Margaret Rose, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You still have it, don't you?" She asked quietly. "The harmonica I gave you for your birthday." He nodded, surprised she remembered. These years, despite the pain it brought him, it was tucked away in his bureau drawer, wrapped in the same blue silk handkerchief she'd tied around it when she gave it to him. "I'll get it," he said, rising from his chair. When he returned with the harmonica, the women had arranged themselves more comfortably on the porch, some sitting on the steps, others in chairs they'd brought from inside. Margaret Rose patted the space beside her on the porch swing, and after a moment's hesitation, Jacob sat down. The harmonica felt strange in his hands after so many years of silence. He began with a simple melody, something soft and melancholy that seemed to fit the mood of the evening. The notes drifted across the prairie, mixing with the sound of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle as his confidence returned. Jacob moved into more complex pieces, folk songs he'd learned as a boy. Melodies he'd picked up during the war, tunes that Margaret Rose had hummed while they'd walked together in what seemed like another lifetime, when he played Shenandoah. Margaret Rose began to sing along softly, her voice blending with the harmonica in perfect harmony. One by one, the other women joined in, their voices creating a chorus that was hauntingly beautiful in the prairie stillness. For the first time since Margaret Rose had knelt in his yard, Jacob felt something like peace settle over the group. Tomorrow they would continue preparing for war. Tomorrow, they would worry about Lord William Ashworth and his hired killers. But tonight, they were simply a group of people who had found each other in the wilderness, creating a moment of beauty in a harsh world. When the last note faded away, they sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, one by one, the women began drifting off to bed until only Jacob and Margaret Rose remained on the porch swing. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the music, for everything. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be safe." Jacob tucked the harmonica into his shirt pocket. "You're not safe yet, Margaret Rose. Not until this Lord William situation is resolved." "I may." "No, but for tonight, sitting here with you, listening to music. It feels like coming home. Her words hit Jacob harder than he'd expected. Home. This ranch had been his refuge, his fortress against the pain she'd caused him. Now she was here, calling it home, and he found himself wondering if maybe it could be that again for both of them. "Margaret Rose," he said carefully, "what happens after? If we get through this, if Lord William is defeated or gives up the chase, what then?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the stars. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I've been focused on survival for so long that I haven't thought much about what comes after surviving. And the other women? They'll need to build new lives, find their own paths. Sarah talks about opening a school someday. Rebecca dreams of having her own ranch with horses. They're strong women, Jacob. They'll figure it out. And you?" Margaret Rose turned to face him, and in the starlight, he could see tears glistening. In her eyes, "That depends on you, I suppose." Jacob's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I love you, Jacob McKenna. I loved you 7 years ago when I made the hardest choice of my life, and I love you now. I know I have no right to expect anything from you after what I did. I know you might never be able to trust me again, but if there's any chance and a possibility that we could find our way back to each other, I want to try." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. Jacob stared at her, this woman who had broken his heart and now offered to heal it. This woman who had brought chaos to his ordered life and somehow made it feel complete again. "I don't know if I can do it," he said honestly. "Trust you again. Open my heart again. 7 years of pain doesn't just disappear because I understand why you caused it." Margaret Rose nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I understand. I'm not asking for promises, Jacob. I'm just asking for a chance. Time to prove that the woman who came back to you is worthy of the love the girl who left you threw away." Before Jacob could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the night. Both of them were on their feet instantly, Jacob's hand moving to his gun while Margaret Rose stepped behind him. "How many?" she whispered. Jacob listened carefully. 2 riders, moving fast. The horses thundered into the yard, and Jacob relaxed slightly when he recognized one of them, Tom Morrison, the sheriff from Cedar Ridge. The other rider was a stranger, a young man who looked like he'd been riding hard for days. "Jacob," Tom called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk. It's urgent." "What's wrong?" Jacob asked, stepping down from the porch. The stranger spoke up, his voice breathless with exhaustion. "Are you Jacob McKenna, the man protecting Margaret Rose Ashworth?" Margaret Rose stepped into the light, her face pale but determined. "I'm Margaret Rose. Who are you?" "My name is Thomas Fletcher. I worked for Lord William Ashworth. I came to warn you. He's not just sending hired killers after you." The young man paused, his face grim. "He's coming himself. He's bringing an army." The peaceful evening shattered like glass. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, their situation had gone from dangerous to desperate. "How many men?" Jacob demanded. 24 professional soldiers. Ex-military. All of them. And Lord William has enough money to outfit them with the best weapons money can buy. Thomas Fletcher wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool night air. "They landed in New York a week ago. They'll be here within days." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "Thomas here rode straight through from the railroad depot. He's been trying to warn you for 3 days? Why?" Margaret Rose asked, studying the young man's face. "Why warn us? If you work for Lord William, worked for him," Thomas corrected firmly. "I quit the day I saw what he did to the housemaid who tried to help you escape. Some things are more important than money, ma'am." Jacob's blood ran cold. "What did he do?" Thomas's face went ashen. "I'd rather not say in front of the ladies. But it was enough to make me realize that Lord William Ashworth is no gentleman. He's a monster." Margaret Rose closed her eyes briefly, and Jacob could see her trembling with barely controlled emotion. Whatever Lord William had done, she could imagine it all too well. "How long do we have?" Jacob asked. 2 days, maybe 3 if we're lucky. They were heading for Denver last I knew, planning to hire local guides and pick up supplies. Jacob's mind raced through calculations. 24 professional soldiers against 1 ex-cavalry man and 6 women, only one of whom had any significant. shooting experience, the odds were impossible. "We need to evacuate," Sheriff Morrison said. "Get the ladies to safety somewhere else." "Where?" Jacob asked. "If Lord William has that kind of money and resources, nowhere in the territory will be safe for long, and we can't keep running forever." "Then what do you suggest?" Margaret Rose asked quietly. Jacob looked at her. At the 5 other women who had gathered on the porch upon hearing the commotion, the young man who had risked everything to warn them. A plan was forming in his mind, desperate, dangerous. Probably suicidal, but possibly their only chance. "We make our stand here," he said finally. "But not the way they'll expect." Over the next hour, Jacob outlined his plan. It was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its requirements. They would use the terrain to their advantage, turn Lord William's superior numbers against him, and rely on surprise and desperation to even the odds. It would require splitting up, which meant some of the women would be on their own in dangerous positions. It would require perfect timing and no small amount of luck. And it would require Margaret Rose to do something that might cost her everything. "You want me to surrender?" To him, she said, when Jacob finished explaining. "To let him think he's won. It's the only way," Jacob replied. "Lord William is coming here for you specifically. If he thinks he has you, he'll let his guard down. That's when we strike. And if the plan fails?" Jacob met her eyes steadily. "Then we'll go down fighting. But I won't let him take you alive." Margaret rose. "I promise you that." The weight of his words settled over the group like a shroud. They all understood what he was really saying, that death would be preferable to whatever fate Lord William had planned for them. "I'll do it, Margaret," Rose said firmly. "Whatever the plan requires, I'll do it." Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. "Jacob, I can't officially sanction what you're planning, but I can make sure I'm conveniently patrolling the far end of the county for the next few days. And if any strangers come through town asking questions, I might forget to mention which direction they should head." "Thank you, Tom." The sheriff mounted his horse, then paused. "For what it's worth, Jacob, I think you're doing the right thing. A man protects what's his, and these ladies are under your protection now." After Morrison rode away, the group spent the rest of the night in frantic preparation. Thomas Fletcher, despite his exhaustion, proved invaluable in providing details about Lord William's men, their weapons, and their likely tactics. "Lord William fancies himself a military strategist," Thomas explained as they gathered around Jacob's kitchen table, maps spread before them. "He'll probably try to surround the ranch, cut off escape routes, then demand surrender. He likes theatrical gestures, makes him feel powerful." "That works in our favor," Jacob said, marking positions on the map. "If he's predictable, we can plan for his moves." As dawn broke over the mountains, their preparations were as complete as time allowed. The women had been assigned positions. Based on their individual strength, Sarah and Rebecca would be hidden in the barn loft with rifles, providing covering fire. Marie and Catherine would be concealed in the root cellar beneath the house, ready to emerge when the signal came. Isabella would be stationed at the creek, holding the horses for a potential escape. Margaret Rose would remain in the house with Jacob, ready to play her part when Lord William arrived. "Remember," Jacob said as they took their final positions, "the signal is 3 shots fired quickly. Don't move before then, no matter what you see or hear. Lord William will probably try to intimidate us first, make threats, show off his superior numbers. Let him. The longer he talks, the more comfortable his men will get." Thomas Fletcher had volunteered to hide in the woods with a rifle, despite Jacob's protests that he'd already done enough. "I need to see this through," the young man had insisted. "I need to know that Monster can't hurt anyone else." As the sun climbed higher, Jacob and Margaret Rose waited in the ranch house, tension thick between them. They could see dust clouds in the distance, Lord William's army approaching. Jacob Margaret Rose said quietly, "If something goes wrong, if the plan fails, I want you to know that these past few days have been the happiest I've had in 7 years." He turned to look at her, memorizing her face in case this was the last peaceful moment they'd have. "Margaret Rose, when this is over, when we get through this, I want to try again. You and me. I want to see if we can build something new from what's left of what we used to have." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Jacob peered out the window and counted riders 24 men, just as Thomas had warned, all armed with military precision. And at their head rode a man who could only be Lord William Ashworth. He was younger than Jacob had expected, perhaps 40, with the pale complexion and soft look of a man who had never done physical labor. But there was something cold and cruel in his eyes that made Jacob's skin crawl. This was a man who enjoyed others' pain. The riders stopped 50 yards from the house, arranged in a perfect military formation. Lord William rode forward alone, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. Jacob McKenna. He called out in an upper-class British accent that dripped with arrogance, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jacob stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "Don't believe I do, Lord William. Everything on this ranch belongs to me." Lord William's laugh was like ice cracking. "But you're wrong about that. You see, my late brother's wife and her companions ran away from their responsibilities. I've come to collect them and bring them home."